It's now my pleasure to introduce our second conversation on philanthropy and the new social covenant with Chelsea Clinton and President DeGioia, who really need no introduction, just a couple of words. Dr. Jack DeGioia is Georgetown's 48th president, a position he's held since 2001, as well as a member of the Global Agenda Council on Values. And Jack, thank you for bringing us all together today. Chelsea Clinton, among her many activities and accomplishments, she's helped to guide the Clinton Foundation as it has built partnerships among governments, businesses, and NGOs to strengthen health systems in developing countries, fight climate change, and expand economic opportunity. Chelsea, thank you so much for joining us. Please join me in welcoming President Jack DeGioia and Chelsea Clinton.
Thank you.
There we go. Thank you so much for being here. It is great to welcome you to campus and to have this opportunity to begin.
It's always great to be here, and particularly in such a beautiful room.
Thank you. So I think you have a little bit of context for what we're wrestling with. We've got a group of colleagues here who, over the course of a few years now, have been trying to seize the opportunities in this moment. With all the challenges that the world faces, is this an opportunity where we can reimagine and recommit ourselves to a core set of values, some values that have actually held together people for most of history. But it's a moment to be explicit about them. And under the leadership of folks like Stuart Wallace and Jim Wallace and Mike Gerson, Tom Banchoff, and the members of the Global Agenda Council that are meeting here right now, we're trying to identify ways in which we can make those values come alive. Values like a commitment to the common good, to the respect and protection of human dignity, to the protection of our environment. And our conversation is going to look at how philanthropy may contribute to that work. We're exploring how government and how business might be able to respond differently in this moment. But with you, we want to explore a little bit about philanthropy. Before we get into some of the detailed questions, tell us a little bit about your own engagement in philanthropy. How did you get to the point where you are now and you're thinking about the role that philanthropy plays both in your life and in your response to some of the challenges you're trying to address in the world?
Well, I am greatly appreciative of all the work that you're trying to push through the new covenant. And I think delineating what the responsibilities of government are versus business versus philanthropy, NGO, social entrepreneurship, whatever you want to call that kind of third universe is really important. I think what gets rendered unto whom is a necessary part of this dialogue, because then we can hold those institutions accountable for what it is that we expect them to do in this recognition of our shared reality. And for me, I actually tried very hard to not have this be my trajectory in life. Not that this needs to be a confession, and I'm not Catholic, but we are sitting in a Jesuit university. I tried very hard to care about other metrics of success in life, whether it be making money or sort of garnering other accolades or things that were more kind of manifestly different than how my parents had judged their own lives. Because I don't think any child wants to grow up and feel just inevitably their parent's child. And yet that's what happened to me, ultimately. And okay, so that's enough of a confession. And as I thought about kind of where I wanted to work and where I wanted to dedicate my energies, I was so drawn to what my father had built through the Clinton Foundation, and really inspired by kind of what I thought I could do there, that not only would I continue to learn from him, as I do every day, but being able to work with him, I thought we could really do more together, whether it be kind of exploiting the fact that I'm a lot younger than he is, and engaging more young audiences like the one here today, or the fact that he infamously got a Twitter account recently, but
we know this because
does he not follow you yet? I'm sorry, I'll work on that.
No, he celebrated his 45th reunion from Georgetown in early June, and he called us on Wednesday of the week of reunion to say he was coming. So we go into lockdown because we want to protect privacy, security. We are so protective.
Thank you.
He goes on his Twitter account and says, I'm going to my Georgetown reunion this weekend. He made 5 events. We were thrilled to have him, but a secret it wasn't.
Right, it created a different conundrum for you. So he, despite having a Twitter account, still sort of self-refers to himself as a Luddite. So trying to figure out how technology can and can't help tackle some of the challenges that we're addressing, and also how it can and can't help us do a better job of holding ourselves to account and measuring what we attempt to do.
Sure. Right at the end of the last panel, we heard a little bit about the way in which we would look to the practices of our government to make come alive some of the most deeply held values that we would share. Moral excellences is the way Michael put it at the end of the last conversation. When you think about philanthropy, how does that enable us to make values come alive?
Well, to take the privilege of sitting in this chair, admittedly, I want to congratulate you on the announcement of the new McCourt School of Public Policy. And at least as I read in the Washington Post this morning, a focus on looking at all this data that the government is putting out there. Because I couldn't agree more with Deanna that there's a difference between sort of transparency, just as what is published, and actual information that is useful in helping people make decisions in their own lives, or helping governments or philanthropies set their own agendas and trajectories. And so I hope that sort of there will be a philanthropic analog to that. Although there is a push, and there was the Paris Declaration in 2005 and the Busan Declaration in 2011, to have better coordination in the aid space, to have better transparency, publish what you fund. That hasn't really happened yet. And so there's still a lot of opacity in aid flows. USAID contracts are not public, so it's true for bilaterals as well as for many kind of large philanthropic foundations. And so having better transparency there is something I hope that once you get through the work of doing that for governments, you'll move to the philanthropic sector.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to pick up on something you said a moment ago, metrics. So Jim Wallace has been driving this Global Action Council on Values to be thinking very hard about what we measure and how we measure it, and how that can be a means by which we can deepen our commitment. How have you wrestled with this question of metrics in terms of your own engagement with these questions?
Well, this is a conversation that's happening kind of with increasing urgency as we approach 2015 and the end of the Millennium Development Goals, and kind of the conversation around whether or not the codification of those goals with attendant metrics to assess progress against them really helped kind of galvanize efforts, or whether or not they really sort of recognized sort of the trajectory and really didn't even impact the slope so much as just kind of foreshadow where the world was already going. I think that this conversation is increasingly relevant, partly because of what Deanna talked about at the end, in that as long as things sort of exist in the shadows, it's easy for us to ignore them. And having more, not only putting a face on poverty, which was the effort of the war on poverty in the 1960s, but relentlessly putting numbers around it and then holding governments responsible, I think is crucial. It's actually something I think we're starting to see happening in New York City. I think the Democratic primary in some ways really evidenced that, although there were lots of different political factors at play. And this is an area where I think philanthropies can really play a big difference, or make a big difference, not only by continuing to shine a light, but by taking risks and piloting interventions that governments often would find difficult because they're not as nimble and they can't move as quickly, or wouldn't think would be a good investment of their own political capital. And so I think that pioneering new feeding programs in schools, new housing programs, domestically, figuring out what to do about the childhood obesity epidemic, things that ultimately, I would argue, probably do belong under the aegis of the government. If philanthropies and NGOs can prove what works, it's much easier to then, I think, persuade governments to step into that path.
Sure, sure. You've spoken before about learning from those who are on the ground, those who are most engaged, those most impacted. That alone demonstrates one of the most profound values that's embedded in the new social covenant, which is a respect for human dignity. How do you actually do that when in the context of the work of the foundation?
So I think dignity is fundamental. And I think so often there is this clientelism, like in philanthropy or in social entrepreneurship, where you are doing something to someone or you are doing something for someone, instead of recognizing that we're all in this together and we'll be better at the end of our journey because we actually have recognized one another. And so in practice, what that means for us is that we are always trying to meet people where they are, try to understand what they need and want, and sometimes those are different things, and sometimes if you just focus on kind of what they need, you're never actually going to be able to help them provide for themselves what they need because they're stuck on what they want. And we're always trying to work ourselves out of a job. So in practice, to give a couple of examples, in Malawi, for example, my father likes to say he's sort of a farmer at heart because he's from Arkansas, and he was getting really frustrated when he would travel around visiting then the foundation's main work around HIV/AIDS, how unproductive the farms he was seeing seemed to be, and how they seemed to only really grow one crop a year. There wasn't rotational farming, there wasn't kind of basic spacing of crops. They certainly didn't have access to high quality seed or fertilizer. And so he started something that we refer to as the Anchor Farm Project, where we now have 6 anchor farms that work with more than 21,000 farmers in Malawi. And over the 4.5 years of the program, they've almost increased their incomes by 600%. And a lot has gone into that, helping them have better access to financing, helping them figure out that used Coke bottle tops actually measure out a perfect amount of fertilizer for maize. And Coke is a logistics company masquerading as a beverage company and is sold in 21 million places around the world every day, so everybody can find a Coke bottle top. And kind of constantly helping them improve. And soon, we will no longer be engaged in that. We're transferring ownership to a for-profit cooperative owned by the farmers themselves, where they've elected their own board of directors, basically, the majority of whom are women, interestingly. And that, to me, is success, because that is about dignity. Although it was a problem my father recognized, no one came to him and said, will you help us figure out how to better grow maize and rotate that in with ground nuts, because ground nuts are a cash crop and maize is what I'm going to feed my families, and will you help us figure out how to use the Coke bottle tops better? It was an iterative process, and although it started from his brain, it was very much determined by our local farming partners. Sure. And hopefully by this time next year, we won't be involved in that project at all, and we're moving on to try to do the same work in Tanzania.
That's a fantastic example. So give us a view. What is it like inside a foundation? How do you establish the priorities that you have now? And just as you've described, when do you know you've accomplished your goals? And how are you thinking about the future? Where would you like to be? Hope in the sense that as your trajectory evolves, there are things that you'd want to take on that right now perhaps might be a little bit beyond the grasp.
I don't think that we're short on optimism or ambition, admittedly. But I think, thankfully, we also have a sense of what we can't do. I mean, there's some things that we're either not big enough to do or not the kind of highest and best use now of the expertise that we've really developed. So we try to be really judicious in thinking about what to do next. And also trying to help find other people to solve problems that we recognize, but we know we're not the right actor for. But one of the things that I am really proud of the foundation for doing is that we also stop doing things that don't work. And I think that that doesn't happen enough in philanthropy. I think inertia is a really powerful force in kind of any organization. I think it's arguably even more powerful in kind of philanthropy because you think you see a problem and you want to solve it so badly, and even if kind of your strategy isn't working out and none of your metrics are moving in the right direction, you just think, well, I need to keep doggedly trying because if I don't, no one else will. Right. Instead of stopping to think, actually, maybe someone somewhere has actually figured this out and would be better positioned to succeed with greater alacrity and sustainability, and we should repurpose our efforts. And we found that in some of the climate change work that we've tried to do, whereas we've been very good at kind of bringing together the right collaborators and figuring out the finance for building retrofits. We're not very good at large-scale forestry projects. Other people are. That's okay. Yeah. So, being forthright about that internally, but also externally, recognizing there's a responsibility, I think, that comes with success. So we, the first work of the foundation was in reorganizing HIV/AIDS drugs markets. And that now has led us into reorganizing long-lasting contraceptive markets, vaccine markets, ORS Sync, which is the therapy to treat childhood diarrhea. And, a lot of people doing that work now came out of the HIV/AIDS community. Right. But when they functionally figured out how to help change high-price, low-volume markets to high-volume, low-price markets, thankfully they've stayed with us and they're continuing to do that work. Yeah.
Tell us what you've learned about partnering. How important is it in the philanthropic context to develop a rich network of relationships that enable you to realize your goals?
I think partnering is everything, because I do really believe that the role of philanthropies or NGOs is to always be trying to work themselves out of a job so they can tackle the next challenge. And the only way really to sustainably do that is if you are collaborating with governments or with the private sector, or in some instances with both. We only work in countries where we have been invited by the government, because particularly for a lot of our health access work, programs that we start around community health worker extension models or building clinics or providing the initial tranche of ORS Sync demand building, because a lot of mothers don't know that that's the best way to treat their children's diarrhea. That work ultimately belongs in the public sector. The health workers at some point, once there's a sufficient revenue base in a country, should be employed by the public sector, or in countries where the private health economy is a greater presence than in the private sector. The clinics similarly should either be run by the public sector or the private sector at some point. And the ORS Sync either should be, if it's a country that largely has government-run pharmacies, sold through the government pharmacies or through the private sector pharmacies. So I think we try to be conscientious about designing our programs from the beginning to have an end, and to have an end for our engagement, but a segue into kind of whatever the right kind of mechanism is for sustaining them. And so if we can design that intentionality with the ultimate kind of providers or purveyors from the beginning, all the better.
That's great. One of the challenges that we've been wrestling with and trying to think through how to deepen this conversation regarding a new social covenant is an obstacle of a lack of trust. That if we're going to build social capital, build on these social networks, there is a lack of trust in our major institutions. None of us are let off the hook on this one. And I'm wondering what experiences you've had in a philanthropic context where you might have some insights to us on how we might be able to build trust, perhaps repair some of the frayed social fabric of our communities, of our nation?
I think recognizing that it has to be restored, and recognizing that probably the restoration of it has to have some generational complexion to it.
Yeah.
My grandmother, who passed away almost 2 years ago when she was 92, because she remembered the halcyon days that were talked about earlier, I think her challenges to recovering trust would have been different than my generation that has no memory of that.
Right.
So kind of calling us back to something. What are we returning to?
Yeah.
Versus projecting forward, where do we want to be in the future? And I think that one of the profound challenges that we have in the United States is that we're a much more segregated society than we ever have been in many ways. So politically, socioeconomically, levels of education, even within cities, kind of where kind of the professional class lives versus where the hipsters live versus where the workers live. I mean, it's not healthy. And how we overcome that, I think, has to be done not only calling us to our higher selves, but having sort of online mechanisms that help reestablish that sense of community. And I think our educational system has to be part of that. The Common Core came up earlier, and I'm, full disclosure, a fan of the Common Core and having unified standards. And yet, in the plans for the future of the Common Core, there's no civic education. And civics isn't required in a majority of states any longer. And this came home to me really clearly when the president came out in support of equal marriage rights. And so many of my friends or people that would stop me on the subway or cab drivers say to me, like, so now we have equal marriage, right? No, like, it doesn't work that way. And we actually have a federalist system. Marriage is a state power. That's, remember, like, why we got it in New York before maybe other states. And there just was no cognizance that if you want to achieve X, that does need to be at the federal government level. If you want to achieve Y, that needs to be at the state government or the local level. So I think we need to re-engage civically and re-embed civics into our educational system, but also into our national dialogue.
Thank you. We're in this conversation with the support, the engagement of the World Economic Forum. So there's a very global distribution of membership, and it's a wonderful group of colleagues who are together on this. Your foundation is very much a U.S. foundation, but deeply engaged globally. What have you learned about the balance of U.S. being a U.S.-based institution, but one engaged globally in the world? How do you wrestle with your perception?
Well, the vast majority of the people who work for the Clinton Foundation work outside the United States. And we really only have one domestic program, which is the Alliance for Healthier Generation, a partnership between the American Heart Association and the Clinton Foundation. And we do try to be disciplined, both we, sort of my family, and we as the foundation, in only tackling things where we believe we can make a difference, even if we think we have a low likelihood of success, where we believe that we are uniquely positioned to make a difference. And my father very much felt that way about heart health after his quadruple bypass. And he called the American Heart Association and said, I want to help. I'm happy to help on any level that you would want me to engage. I'll hold the heart teddy bear, which was their mascot that year, or I'll try to help tackle a big problem. What can I do? And they said, we want you to help with childhood obesity, which is certainly not what he expected the answer to be. And now I think we have a much greater awareness than we did in 2005 of what a challenge childhood obesity is in our country. I don't know the statistics for Washington, but in New York City, when school started last week, 1 out of 5 kids that walked into kindergarten was obese. Not just overweight, but obese. And close to 1 out of 3 kids in the public school system in America is overweight or obese. So even if the Affordable Care Act kind of manifests in its currently constructed form, if we don't kind of tackle this challenge, not only will life expectancy start to decline, which I think would be a horrible comment on our moral fiber as a country, but our healthcare costs would become even more prohibitive than they already are. And so my father said, okay, childhood obesity. He was already doing some work through the Clinton Presidential Center with the Arkansas School District. And so he said, all right, we'll start in schools. And so now the Alliance is the largest anti-childhood obesity program in schools. We touch more than 11.5 million kids every day through more than 18,000 schools. And we've started to see obesity level off in many of our districts. It's only declining in a couple, but you have to stop an upward spiral, I think, before you can reverse it. So we're hoping that we're at that tipping point. Sure. And it's been through working with private partners like Pepsi and Coke and convincing them to take the full-calorie sodas out of all the vending machines in our schools, convincing them to only put snack-sized products in the vending machines, because you used to be able to buy like a family bag of Doritos, because that's a good thing to eat for lunch. And in helping all of the procurement for the food services, sure, so that kids are getting a healthy lunch. But we're now trying to figure out what more we can and should be doing, not only in extending that program, but where else is there a need. So you were asking earlier about kind of how do I make decisions? I'm obsessed with the juvenile justice food system. There are 53,000 kids on any given day under the supervision of the juvenile justice system in the United States. The only people that at least ostensibly have a constitutional right to health are those actually under the supervision of the juvenile justice system or the adult correctional systems in various states or at the federal level. And Georgia, I think, is the only state that has even moderate guidelines on what kids should be fed when they're in juvenile halls. So we now have programs in every state. We have people embedded in many of the largest school districts in the country. Many of the largest school districts in the country, not surprisingly, correlate to the largest juvenile detention facilities in the country. And so hopefully we'll be able to soon start doing the same work, sure, there that we're doing in the public school system.
Thank you. We're going to open this up in a moment. I want to ask one more question before I encourage our colleagues to jump in. Part of the purpose of these 2 days here is to explore ways in which we can take this document out to foster dialogue and to introduce the concepts and to really try to engage folks. And as you think about the engagement of your foundation and your own experiences, what advice would you have for us in terms of where you would target this conversation, and how might we engage in this conversation in ways that might really have an impact?
Oh gosh, well, you know, as you probably know, in sub-Saharan Africa, the majority of the population is under 30. Right. So if youth voters engaged in their country's elections at the same level that we saw, you know, young voters engage here recently, you know, they could change literally who was in office and help then change the agenda and their own futures. So I would, you know, figure out how to connect with young people, not only here in the United States, but around the world. And there are now more smartphones on every continent except for Africa than old-fashioned phones, and there are more cell phones in the world than there are people. So I'd have a mobile version, and I'd evangelize about it, and I'd find out who the influencers are in places like, you know, Nigeria and, you know, South Africa and elsewhere.
Thank you. Thank you. Jim and Mike, I think you got to start looking at a new app for the new social covenant.
So do you use YouVersion, the Bible app? Do you know all right, so YouVersion, the Bible app, which is one of the largest apps on the Apple Store. It has more than 108 or 9 million downloads now. It's kind of in the echelon with Twitter and Instagram. They're in more than 400 languages now, and I would figure out how to engage either those developers or someone else like that, so that when you release your mobile app, which you're going to do now, I hope, it can be simultaneously released in multiple languages, so that there's not kind of this feeling that I think also often happens of people feeling like English and French, maybe Chinese, maybe Russian. So maybe you get all 6 official languages of the UN, but often English and French lead even from many of the UN organizations in how they publish. I think if you can publish simultaneously in multiple languages online, that gives you just such an instant credibility of dignity and recognizing that you're taking this to where people are.
Thank you. Thank
Sure.
you. Let's open it up. Yes, please. And introduce yourself.
I'm David Saperstein. I represent the Reformed Jewish movement here in Washington. First, I think you got a lot of bemused, sympathetic reaction from people about wondering about being defined as following in the footsteps of your parents. After hearing the clarity, incisiveness, and power of your remarks, it's going to be hard to shake for you. When you came on, there was excitement about the connection with the younger generation. You alluded to that. So I want to pick up on your comments about the youth bulge. 70% under 30 in Africa, 40% under 50, the age of 15 in Africa. As you think about addressing the youth bulge, the opportunities, as education rises, the challenges as economic opportunities don't rise, the growing frustration and despair in a world in which all the have-nots now know, because of social media and other media, what the haves have. Here, to what extent does that, in your thinking, in the foundation, become an issue in and of itself as you think of partnerships with government, business, and NGOs and philanthropy? Is that something that you deal with as a byproduct to the other things you're doing, or do you think about the youth bulge as something that needs to be addressed, and how does that thinking, in what directions does that thinking take?
Well, the answer is yes and no, or both, I guess. In that we think of youth the same way we sort of think of women. There's some things that we solve specifically for, like on the ORS Sync building demand. We're working now in Nigeria, Uganda, Kenya, and 3 states in India. And for example, in Nigeria, when we started our work, only probably 2% of the kids who were getting severely dehydrated because of diarrhea were receiving ORS Sync at home. So by the time they were getting to the clinics, they were already much sicker. And we couldn't survey mothers to figure out what they were doing. So we had to extrapolate from that. Okay, so 98% of the kids who are getting sick, so 98% of their mothers don't know that they actually could treat their kids at home. They wouldn't have to take them all the way to the clinic. They would get better faster. So we needed to not only change the price dynamics, we needed to build the market to guarantee that we didn't have to eat all of the kind of financial guarantees we'd given to the manufacturers for this volume of ORS Sync. That we targeted largely to mothers, educating mothers through working with clinic networks, local pharmacy networks, working with Coca-Cola, that is now like the greatest friend of public health, at least outside of North America and Europe. And that then had to be kind of sort of diagnosed and determined through women. There's some things like around farming, which we're increasingly doing more of because of how successful, thankfully, our anchor farm work was in Malawi, which now has become the paradigm for the whole country. So we thought it was going to just be a kind of into a private sector model, and now it is how President Banda is trying to develop agriculture in her country. There are a lot of young people who don't want to stay on the farms, which is why kind of the want and need have to be coupled together. And so trying to figure out how can we get televisions there? How do we incentivize or help the government incentivize stores to open that sell TVs, or the electric grid to go there, or there's someone in Kenya who's working on a prototype of a solar-powered television. How do we think about these things coherently? The young people still may decide they don't want to stay on the farms, but right now they say they don't want to stay on the farms, not just because it's more exciting to be in Lilongwe, the capital, but because they can't watch like the football match they want to watch on television, or they can't buy the products they want to buy. So, as we brainstorm with our government partners, but our private sector partners, and try to really think about, well, what does kind of creative collaboration mean in this context as we think about trying to help Malawi be able to feed itself in a decade, which is what the president aspires to. And as she's now taking this anchor farm model, it's somewhat dependent on not just making the farmers who are already working the land more efficient, but ensuring that the next generation, at least some part of the next generation, stays. So sometimes there have to be specific solutions designed for youth employment, youth engagement, but they're often part of the larger aegis of we're trying to help in Malawi, for example, or we're doing similar work in Rwanda and increasingly in Tanzania. The government solve much more holistic challenges.
Great. Questions? Yes, please, and introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Ann Kelgard, and I work here at Georgetown. So we've done a great job of outlining a lot of these global challenges and a need to cultivate new leaders and leadership in addressing them. And I was wondering what your thoughts were on what the best ways to instill a sense of values and a call to service, whether it be through the public sector, private, or philanthropic, in the next generation is.
I'm so happy you asked that question. Next year will be the 20th anniversary of AmeriCorps, which is something that I'm particularly proud of my father. I'm proud of my father for lots of reasons, but I'm particularly proud of him for creating AmeriCorps for a few reasons. One, because it kind of gave an outlet to this clear demand that young people had to serve. And I think that just in and of itself was an important signal, that we had a way for young people to serve if they felt called to the military, but not if they really felt called to sort of civilian service. Second, because it is a partnership across multiple levels of government. So cities, counties, states can say to AmeriCorps, we need help in our local parks. Or we need help with data entry to figure out how to have traffic move more efficiently. I mean, there can be very specific requests that cities and states say that they could use an AmeriCorps Corps member for a year, or in some instances 2 years, to help solve. And yet, in most years, AmeriCorps gets 10 applications for every 2 spots that it has. And so although we somewhat did a better job of creating supply for demand, there's clearly still a great disequilibrium between what young people and increasingly actually retired people who want to participate in AmeriCorps are saying, I want to serve, and the opportunities available for them to serve. And so I hope, and this is something that actually there's legislation that has said we should fully fund AmeriCorps, and it was passed and the president signed it, but we haven't had a budget since 2009, and we're probably not going to get one this year. It just doesn't seem to be heading in that direction. And so this is something that I think sadly, like poverty, gets neglected because it either isn't sort of so urgent, or because as much as young people have politically participated more reliably, we're still not remotely at the levels of either percentage participation or numbers of older people. So disappointed young people getting slightly disaffected because they couldn't serve in AmeriCorps isn't a kind of do or die political pivot for people. But I hope that the 20th anniversary can put some coherent political pressure, and I hope that this can, again, as it was in its original incarnation, be depoliticized. There's a lot of Republican and Democratic gubernatorial mayoral support for fully funding AmeriCorps, and so I hope that that in particular, sort of the localized base of support, will kind of push Congress to actually appropriate the money so that AmeriCorps can be fully funded. And I hope that if that happens and it as successful as we all would hope it would be, that could start to build a path to real citizen service in our country. And I think it would send a very strong message to young people that we value citizen service just like we value military service, and we want anyone to be able to grow up and serve in AmeriCorps.
Just building on that question and recognizing the political and financial challenges that we might face, thoughts about mandatory national service?
I don't support mandatory national service. I do support, though, everyone who wants to serve being able to have the opportunity to serve.
Okay. Thank you.
And I think, and countries that have moved, and increasingly, particularly the last 20 years, there are very few countries in the world that still have mandatory military service. And many that do have sort of mandatory service, it's 6 months between the ages of like 18 and 35. So you can sort of apportion it over a long period of time when it's convenient and not necessarily kind of when you're called to do it. And the countries that have introduced voluntary mechanisms of service have seen really remarkable results. And we certainly have seen that in our country. So I hope that it's something that we do, but other countries like France that are considering doing it on a national scale will also do.
Thank you. Thank you. Questions? Yes, please.
Thank you both so much for your comments today. My name is Larissa Friesenhall, and I'm with Sojourners. And on the theme of leadership, I heard a question come out of one of the World Economic Forum meetings, especially in light of the 5-year anniversary of the collapse of Lehman Brothers. The question I remember hearing is, what if Lehman Brothers were Lehman sisters? Would it have collapsed? And my question for you, Chelsea, is how does the role of women in leadership help us get closer, faster to the ideals that we're talking about in the social covenant? And what can we be doing to help more women rise in leadership in philanthropy and government and the private sector? So I'd love to hear your comments on that.
So in my previous life, when I worked on Wall Street, I was actually in the courtroom the night that the sale between Barclays and Lehman Brothers fell apart. So I think that, sadly, probably Lehman Brothers would have failed if it were Lehman sisters. But that's more a comment on the political moment, I think, than on sort of the legal or the financial realities of it. But to answer your actual question, this is sadly also current because of the kind of trove of data that emerged earlier this week. Women actually lost half a cent in earnings parity to men. So we went from 77 cents to 76.5 cents per dollar in 2012, controlling for different professions. So it's not just sort of a gross average. And that's depressing to me. And that's not the only indicator that women are losing ground in helping to build a future. So one of the things that I am obsessed with are women in technology and getting girls access to high quality technology education from an early age. And one of the reasons I'm obsessed with this is that because in 1987, which was the year that I got a Commodore computer from Santa Claus, women made up 36% of the computer science college graduates. The year I graduated from Stanford, we were just above 20%, and last year we were 12%. And the Department of Commerce says that, a huge number of jobs, maybe up to 1 million jobs between 2012 and 2022 are going to be created in the technology industries or in more conventional industries, but in ways that will require technological fluency. And so we are losing ground in the future. And I think we have to change that dynamic. And we know at the 4th grade level, girls perform just as well or just as excited about math and science. They want to grow up and be astronauts. And by 8th grade, none of those are true. Girls aren't performing as well in math, they're not performing as well as science, and very few of them want to grow up and be engineers or astronauts or research scientists. And I think that's a big challenge. So I think that some of it is making technology like sexy and cool. Like we need more female superheroes and we need more women to break out of kind of hypersexualized roles on shows like CSI. I actually think Hollywood has a really important role to play here. And we need kind of more educational opportunities and pedagogy that encourages girls to stay invested and excited about things in the future. And then more broadly, we need role models. I mean, the reason there's so much kind of consternation about whatever Marissa Mayer says is because like she's pretty lonely as a woman CEO. Because women's, like the number of women CEOs in the Fortune, take your pick, 100, 500, 1,000, the presence of women in boardrooms has largely not moved for at least as long as we've been paying serious attention. So I think, what was being talked about earlier, holding business accountable for not just solving for who might shareholders react positively to today, but who's actually going to help build your company for the future. Because women control 2/3 of the purchasing power in the United States. Like if I were a consumer goods company, like I think I would want women to be part of my decision making and my strategy and my visioning. So holding companies accountable for not having women, rewarding those who do have women on their boards or in their C-suite, helping expand the universe of possibilities for what little girls believe they can and should do by having visible role models, either real or kind of in entertainment, in the sciences, in politics, in business, in philanthropy, I think is really important.
If I could just take a moment and
Please.
Expand on it just for a second. In December of 2011, your mom was here, and she presented President Obama's executive order essentially requiring our government to include women in all of the work we do for peace building. And at that time, she announced a partnership with Georgetown where we would establish an institute on women, peace, and security. And last February of this year, we launched that formally. Milan Verveer, Ambassador Verveer, serves as the executive director of that institute. And it is, just to take what we're describing now just a little bit further, it's a recognition that a lot more than the financial crisis might have been transformed or changed by virtue of a more inclusive engagement of all of us in the effort to wrestle with some of these challenges. So our new institute was inspired by your mom's visit and encouraged, and we're very honored to provide a home for that work now.
And that's going back to Lysistrata and sort of the great Greek plays in which women sort of changed the trajectory of security negotiations or war, through in Northern Ireland, when even the most sort of hardened leaders of Sinn Féin and the Ulster nationalists and unionists all acknowledged at Stormont that they wouldn't have reached that point of being able to form a government if their mothers and sisters and wives hadn't said they were tired of going to funerals. So I think there is a history of women really being able to play that role. We should make that more visible so that those stories are more well known. But we have to make women more visible and empowered across the spectrum.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. Please.
Hello, and thank you. My name is Sidi Atara. I'm a global shaper from the Bamako hub in Mali, West Africa. So you've mentioned earlier that the foundation only operates in countries where it's been invited by the government authorities, and that also in Africa, the majority of the young people are under the ages of 30, and then if they vote enough, they could change the people in the office and make their new agendas. So in that spirit, I was wondering if there is any plan from the foundation or America or maybe to expand its operations to countries and targets countries where there is no mechanism in place to promote citizen service or philanthropy, if there are people that are there that are willing to do some actions to change the state of their communities, but there is no system in place, put in place by the government and the private sector. Is there anything you can do or intend to do in that spirit?
It's a great question. We do not, but we can help you, literally you, not just you as a kind of term of verbal usage, find organizations who do work in so-called fragile state environments. We, for example, don't do any work in the DRC, but we've enfranchised a lot of partner organizations to access our lower cost medicines so that they can then spend more of their dollars on other work. And in Ethiopia, where we do health work, we don't do citizen engagement work, but we do allow other organizations who are trying to advance other work to do things that may sound parochial but are important, like use our office space. So we try to be good citizens in places where we have no footprint, or in places where we do one work but others are doing important work that we want to be supportive of in whatever ways we can be. So if you find me afterwards and there are things that we could try to help you with in Mali, we have a large presence in West and Central Africa, but not in Mali. We could try to see if we can help you at least on the health commodities side. Sure.
We got time for one more question. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Phil Thomas. I work here at Georgetown. My question is going back to a reference that you made earlier about sort of the halcyon days earlier in U.S. history when there was more of a social compact in place than there is now and inequality was less. Of course, even then, it wasn't truly inclusive, especially for ethnic minorities and women, LGBT people, and others. And I guess, and of course, these divisions persist to this day. And my question is, as we work to establish a new social compact, how can we ensure that our efforts are truly inclusive of these groups that are still suffering from severe inequality and severe social issues?
Ensure that they have a seat at the table. I mean, I have a pretty old-fashioned view about that type of inclusion. I think the people who are at the table matter. And I think ensuring that everyone expresses his or her own views matters. Because historically, in kind of collaborative, iterative efforts, often people were invited in but still remained silent because they just had been silent for so long. And it's hard to speak up if your silence has been your protection. And so finding and committing to not just inviting people into the room, but equally validating, expecting, encouraging, and if need be, kind of, eliciting people's voices and opinions, I think is how you guarantee inclusion.
Thank you. You've made a very special day that much more special by your presence with us, and we're grateful for this opportunity to engage with you this way. And thank you. Wish you the very best.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.